It's Sunday, it's Newscast. We're recording this at 11 o'clock when we have just had an update from the British Transport Police after a terrible attack on the 6:25 Doncaster to London King's Cross. The big headline from the last few minutes, Alex, is this.
At this stage, there is nothing to suggest that this is a terrorist incident. This is a British Transport Police investigation, and we continue to work to establish at pace the full circumstances and the motivations that have led to this incident. At this early stage, it would not be appropriate to speculate on the cause of this incident.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I can't even begin to think what it must have been like for the people on that train. And immediately the news started to come through. You know, we had some eyewitness accounts of just how awful it was, the politicians saying how horrific. But what a lot of people were trying to fathom was the motive and what happened here. And I think the critical bits we heard from that press conference were this, really. Firstly, that the police saying that nothing supports the fact that this is a terrorist incident, really, really key. And the other thing is the two people they've got in custody, a 32-year-old black British national and a 35-year-old British national of Caribbean descent, both born in the UK. The police clearly very keen to get that information out.
So, on today's Newscast, we will hear all the information that we have about that attack on the Doncaster to London train. We'll hear from eyewitnesses, the police, and the politicians, all on this episode of Newscast. Hello, it's Laura in the studio.
Hello, it's Alex in the makeshift home studio.
And it's looking very lovely, your home studio, as I remarked yesterday. A lovely place to be and lovely to have you with us as Paddy is on his hauls. So, as you were just saying, there has, in the last half hour, been a police press conference after the news broke late last night about an unimaginable horror. Just imagine being a passenger on a train when there's somebody, two people in this case, who we believe to have been trying to attack people, stabbing multiple people. And as we speak, there have been many people who are in hospital, some with life-threatening injuries, but some who happily have already been discharged. Let's just bring you the bullet points, if you like, from the press conference from the police.
Yeah, so we'll do a run through. So we had this update from Superintendent John Lovelace, as you say, not so long ago in the last 20 minutes, and we're recording this at 11 a.m. And he said that this was the 6:25 train from Doncaster. He said around 7:42, the calls started to come into the police about reports of multiple stabbings on this service. Armed officers were deployed. They then went onto the train that stopped at Huntingdon Station. And with 8 minutes of that 999 call, they had two men in custody. He gave the details about the people that they had arrested: a 32-year-old black British national, a 35-year-old British national of Caribbean descent, both born in the UK, both arrested on suspicion of attempted murder. And of course, the victims, the people who were affected by this, 10 initially taken to hospital. And overnight, we had reports that 9 of those had life-threatening injuries. We now know that 4 have been discharged, but there are still 2 patients with life-threatening conditions. And then he did go on to say that while counter-terrorism police were initially supporting this investigation, there is nothing, according to the police, that suggests this is a terrorist incident. So that's what we know so far about this horrendous incident on this train service.
And in any episode like this, Alex, we have to be incredibly careful about the concrete facts that we are aware of in any situation like this. And it was interesting on the programme this morning, all our politicians talked about the need not to allow speculation to run rife, for people not to circulate information online that was conjecture or guessing, or even people trying to stir things up. So those are Newscasters, the concrete facts as we have them at 11:05 on Sunday morning. Let's hear then from one of the people who was actually on that train. This is Ollie Foster.
There was a girl, bless her, who was really, really in a bit of a state because the guy had actually tried to stab her, and one of the older guys, who's an absolute hero, blocked it with his head, and he's got this like gash. He had this gash on his head. He's got I think, a gash on his neck, and he's we're giving him like our jackets to keep the pressure on the blood.
So what was interesting here, Alex, is that between 9 and 10, all the politicians on the programme said, we hope that the police will give us information about identity and nationality of the attackers as quickly as they can. And that does appear, in fact, to be what's happened. The police were very careful to give the nationality and ethnicity. And I suppose, I reckon that's a response to what happened in the days after the terrible Southport attacks.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing. It's almost become a feature now of this kind of incident and then subsequent investigation. It's like another consideration for the police, because what they are conscious of and aware of, and we did see it in the wake of those horrendous Southport attacks, was because of social media, because of the way that people respond to something like this, because of the speculation and quite often mis and disinformation that is so quickly put out into the public domain and can get traction so quickly. Police are now very deliberately and consciously having to make decisions about what they can release and when, and it feels like there is a sort of real pressure for them to release that kind of information about race and ethnicity and nationality as soon as they possibly can. And if you remember, Laura, after that incident with the Liverpool football parade, you know, police were very quick at that point to release details about the suspect who'd been arrested because they wanted to stop speculation or misinformation online. And it seems like in this case, we've had something very similar. You know, it was right up front and centre of that press conference this morning when they did tell us about the nationality of the two men who've been arrested. And it is exactly for that reason. It's like a feature now of policing and policing decisions that they are having to consider when and how they release this information because of the threat of this misinformation.
And it's fascinating, isn't it? Because that is a concrete change in a very serious bit of public policy. How do the authorities react to something that might look like a terrorist incident? So how do they react to a serious form of crime? And they're reacting to a change in everybody's behaviour and the kind of things that people get up to on their phones or tablets or laptops. And that is now a feature of these kinds of stories and these kinds of terrible events. And it's a change, because it used to be, and politicians would also sort of dance around it. They would say, well, we can't say anything because the police are operationally independent. It's not up to us. They'll release the information when they can. And that political pressure is now very definitely there. It was there on display this morning. It was there also, remember, in the terrible synagogue attack, which is only a few weeks ago. Then also the police in Greater Manchester moved very quickly to give as much information as they could about the identity of the attacker, partly, of course, because those images were out there on social media. We haven't seen any of those kind of images yet in the public domain. It may be by the time you listen to this, newscasters, or the time you watch this, that there are images circulating and are available to show more of what happened on the train. But it is one of the things that in 2025 has led the authorities to treat these kinds of events in a different way because of the impact of what technology has done to society. And of course, politicians were also using technology to give their responses too, weren't they? What did Keir Starmer say?
Yeah, well, he was out there quite quickly on social media expressing his concern about this attack, you know, and again, the message from politicians all about how horrendous this attack is and their thoughts with the victims and praise for the first responders and the paramedics. So we heard from Keir Starmer on social media. We also heard from Kemi Badenoch, who spoke to you about it, Laura, on your programme, saying something quite similar. And what I was really struck by from all of the politicians that you spoke to was them urging transparency about this quickly, you know, so they wanted the authorities to give as much information as they could, as quickly as they could. But it's also interesting that when you speak to people, senior people in policing, they say that does pose another challenge because they have to weigh that up with the operational concerns about what information they can release without potentially jeopardizing any ongoing investigation. You know, it's another complexity to these already really complex and fast-moving police investigations.
We are a long way away from back in the day when you and I were trainee journalists going through the tomes of the rules and regulations about what you could or couldn't report, and the police would often give as tiny amounts of information as they possibly could because of their fear about impacting or affecting an investigation or a potential future court case. Times have very definitively changed. Given the fact, though, as things stand, there isn't a belief and there isn't evidence that this is a terror attack. We also heard from John Healey, who's the Defence Secretary, who was with us this morning, and he was urging people essentially to go about their business normally, to be vigilant, yes. But he said that the public was resilient. People shouldn't be changing their behaviour. They shouldn't be terribly worried about this, although they should be vigilant when they're out and about and on the transport system. But he said, look, like lots of people, he's somebody who uses that train line.
This has been shocking and very close to home for me. I was on that very service with my wife Jackie yesterday, just a few hours before the attack. It's a line I use every week to get home to Rotherham. And I pay huge tribute to the passengers, but also the emergency services for the way they responded, because this might have been so much worse if they hadn't acted in the way that they did.
Yeah, so I mean, the Defence Secretary there talking, and I guess many people will be actually having a sort of similar thing when you think how often you use the trains, about how, for him it felt so close to home because he'd been on that service only a couple of hours earlier, which, you cannot forget the kind of human side of all this and those compelling eyewitness accounts from the people who just must have been absolutely terrified in that enclosed space. But, back to the kind of the wider challenge of policing and how they deal with the aftermath of these incidents, which clearly have such a huge impact on individuals involved, but also kind of wider society, because people think, my goodness, what has happened here? And that feeling that, could it have been me in that moment when it happens on a public train, just on a kind of Saturday evening? But I think when you have these incidents that capture such public attention, there's a clamour for information, and the politicians saying we have to be as transparent as possible. It's actually worth remembering that quite recently there was some interim updated guidance to police forces who was saying you should, where you can, release as much data as you can about the suspects to stop the spread of misinformation. And at the time, the Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, who of course is now as the Foreign Secretary, was saying that was something that she really supported, this push for transparency. But I think the other thing we've heard while this debate has kind of gone on in the aftermath of other really significant incidents like this is some senior figures in policing saying the danger of that is that sometimes it can set a precedent. So there might be times when police can release that information very quickly, but there might be times others when for operational reasons it's quite difficult for them to do that, and then there becomes a kind of public expectation that if there is if that information isn't released and there's a vacuum, what might fill it on social media? It's just all speaks to this kind of new world that we're in, and how much social media has changed so much of the way that things just used to be or used to be accepted. It's this other thing that has to be considered in almost every aspect of life. And when you get horrific incidents like this, it is a major consideration now, and in a way that it just wasn't, as you say, 15, 20 years ago, when you used to just follow the kind of standard procedure, and police would put out the kind of bare minimum in some cases.
Not even 5 years ago, perhaps. And it's another one of those real examples of how institutions, maybe I'm going to sound a bit highfalutin for a moment, but institutions just don't have, in some way, the same control of the information flow that they did for such a very long time. And one big institution this week has certainly lost control of the information flow. The one that we were talking about yesterday, the royal family and the palace.
Yeah, completely. I mean, I tell you what really struck me this morning was we were having that conversation yesterday about whether or not what had happened with Andrew was going to change the way that politicians and Parliament and the institutions of this country interacted with each other. Whether parliamentarians, whether ministers might be more willing to challenge the royal family, or at least break away from those conventions where they would tiptoe so carefully and cautiously around it. And of course, you spoke to John Healey, the Defence Secretary, this morning, who gave you this interesting information that actually they were now looking at stripping Andrew of one of his military titles, which is like another significant step around all of this.
So let's just remind people first that Andrew, as was Prince Andrew, now Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor, was in the military. He was in the Navy. He saw service in the Falklands War. He's got lots of military medals because of that service. And he was a commander in the Royal Navy. And as of late last night, we sort of realised that he still was technically a vice admiral in the Navy. And given everything that's happened, given how his own behaviour has led to his own brother basically booting him out of the formal part of being in the royal family, it felt like a very pertinent question this morning to ask the Defence Secretary whether or not it was appropriate that he still had this very important, at least theoretically very important role as being a vice admiral in the Royal Navy. And as you said, John Healey, essentially, I suppose he's someone who doesn't mince his words, but he's not somebody who courts controversy, essentially told us that, the king has asked us to get rid of the title, and therefore that's what we're going to do. We
are working now to remove that last remaining title of Vice Admiral that he has.
So he will be stripped of his remaining military title?
We're working with the palace. We're working on that at the moment.
Yeah, another big step really for Andrew. It leads you to the question about where does this where does this keep going, you know, at this point? But what was interesting, I thought, about what the Defence Secretary said was that he was also very clear that they were still being led by the family. So back to that kind of conversation, I think when it comes to government ministers specifically, despite the fact that they are now willing to engage in this conversation in the way that John Healey was, you're willing to say, yeah, look, this is what we're looking at doing, stripping him of this title, he was still very much deferring, I thought, in the way he was responding to the family and the king, and saying, like, this is in collaboration, this is what the king wants us to do, we are kind of being led by what the family wants, as opposed to the government charting its own course on this.
You know, I still though wonder, Alex, a couple of weeks ago, and certainly a couple of months ago, and definitely a couple of years ago, if as a journalist you'd gone anywhere near asking a government minister about this, my hunch is still that they would have kind of said, that's a matter for a different conversation. That's just not something I'm going to speculate about. Matters to do with the royal family are nothing to do with you, pesky journalist. Or you might even have ended up with a sort of, ha, as Boris Johnson used to always do, nice try kind of answer. And then here, John Healey, the Defence Secretary, perfectly happy to say, yes, the King has indicated that he would like us to remove the title, and that is something that we are going to do. You're right, though, that note of deference, we're doing it because the King has asked us to do it, was also most definitely there. And had though John Healey not said that, I reckon probably by the end of the day, you'd have had opposition politicians maybe jumping on that bandwagon and saying, here's the next thing, boot him out the Navy, get rid of that Vice Admiral title. It's time for that to disappear too. Interesting, though, there was no indication from John Healey that Andrew should hand back or lose his military medals. And we looked at this in our research for the interview, and he's got quite a lot of medals, but stripping somebody of medals that they've earned during service was not something that they are looking at. And I don't get a sense that that is a place that opposition politicians would want to go to. You know, you can't change the past. Andrew might wish he could change the past, but he can't change the past, even though he always denies he's done anything wrong. But you can't change the fact that he did see active service. He did therefore get medals, and that's separate to the honorific, to use the fancy word, the honorific military titles that he had alongside those.
Yeah, and I think you're right that there was the signal from John Healey was that they weren't going to go there at this point. But on the stripping of the military title, you know, I think for the royal family, and actually another one of your guests, Vine Lowe, made this point. These are actually quite important titles for them. You know, this is something that they hold really important, is that their role in the military, but also for the service personnel who often, you know, who have that really quite close relationship because they serve on behalf of His Majesty's government, you know, His Majesty's services. So I think it's not just like another thing that's gone for Andrew. I think that actually that's a quite significant thing that they're considering doing it. But my feeling is you're completely right. Had the Defence Secretary not said that, there would have been a clamour around this. And I think with ministers, there is now this acceptance that the status quo was just not okay when it comes to Andrew. They could just not lean back on, this is all to do with the palace, we can't have a perspective. And the reason for that is because public opinion was becoming so apparent that people were not satisfied with the way that all of this had unfolded, the time that it's taken to get to the point it has, how long all of this has been going on. And for all of the people who have expressed support for the decision by the King to strip Andrew of titles and lodgings, there have been people who've said, why didn't it happen sooner? So I think ministers who are so alive to public opinion and perception now are finding themselves in the position where they can't come on programs like yours and say nothing. You know, they have to be able to say something. But it's undoubtedly a huge shift in the place that we were not so long ago in the way that they're dealing with this. It's just whether or not this is confined to Andrew or whether or not this becomes something more broad that I think is still the really interesting question.
Yeah, and that's just not clear at this stage, is it? And you see from time to time, public opinion does kind of, you know, it does sort of spike and then go down and then spike and then go down in terms of support for the royal family generally. But we just don't know at this point whether or not this is going to lead to a shift in public opinion that says, actually, we don't want a monarch anymore, get rid of a lot of them. It's just far too early to say that. Or whether or not the royal family can hope that the public's very obvious disgust and unhappiness at Andrew's behaviour and him carrying on being funded by the royal family in the way that he has been and living in splendour in Windsor, does that translate to a wider shift? Who knows? But it's worth remembering also, he's still going to live at Sandringham. And he's still going to live on the King's private income. And I just wonder how that will hold. Will it hold? Will everybody move on? I don't know. And as ever, timing is everything in politics and the news. And had it not been for that awful attack on the train, the story of the king booting Andrew out of his Royal Navy Vice Admiralty, that would in and of itself be a really big story. But because everybody today is quite rightly concentrating on the train, it perhaps might not be a story that enters the public conscience in the same way.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the one thing that's worth remembering about all this is that people are saying, look, now Andrew is an ordinary citizen. But for many people, I think they think, living on the Sandringham estate, sort of still being funded by the king, albeit in a private capacity, doesn't feel very ordinary to them. And so I think, you have to kind of wonder, exactly as you say, who knows where this goes from here. But while undoubtedly Andrew has sort of been cast out quite, bluntly by the family, that still's not going to feel like a sort of ordinary citizen life to many people.
Let's then just have a final word about some matters politic that, again, on a different day, might have felt like quite a big story. Because Christina McEnee, the boss of the Unison Union, which is one of the biggies, she's normally someone, isn't she, Alex, who might give the kind of odd, gentle rebuke here and there to the government. But I would have put her until this morning kind of in the loyal-ish category.
Yeah, the kind of maybe sceptical, loyal-ish category. Unafraid to maybe point out when things maybe aren't going in the direction that she would necessarily like. But blimey, she went a lot further than that this morning. She was so clear in her unhappiness and dissatisfaction with the direction of the Labour government. It was blunt from her, really. And you got to remember that this Unison, it's got 1.3 million members. It's the big public services union. It represents a lot of people who will be associated with the Labour movement. And she was, I thought, really, she was the way that she naturally phrases things is pretty cautious. But I think you read into what she was saying, and she was really expressing the level of unhappiness and dissatisfaction about the direction of the government. She was kind of blunt.
She was. She said it had been shocking. And then I asked her, will Keir Starmer still be the Prime Minister and the leader of the Labour Party after the May elections?
I think it's time for a reset in Labour. It's time for the government to really look.
And will Keir Starmer still be the leader of the Labour Party after the May elections?
Who knows? I don't know.
You don't know? Well, that is very significant that you say you don't know.
Well, no, I don't know because I don't know what will happen in May, and I don't know, depending on what happens in May, what Keir will feel about it, or indeed the Labour MPs will feel about it. I expect he will be, but I couldn't honestly guarantee it.
OK.
Now, I've got to say, I was pretty surprised that she went that far. There is a huge private soundtrack in the Labour Party that's being played at the moment in Parliament, and when you talk to MPs on the phone or wherever in the corners of Westminster or, the bars around the party conference, there is absolutely a conversation about whether or not, if the May elections are as disastrous as people fear, will there be a challenge to Keir Starmer's leadership. But only a few people have put their head above the parapet to engage in that in public. And I have to say, I do think it's significant that Christina McEnee, who we'd normally say is in the loyalish bracket, for her to enter into that conversation publicly, I do think will make people feel nervous in the Labour leadership. It's also worth saying that, like all union general secretaries, she also has to be elected by her members. And that is a process at the moment that is underway in the Unison Union. So union leaders are also politicians too, even if they're not elected by the general public.
Yeah, completely right. I completely agree with you that I think it was really interesting that she said what she said about not being able to guarantee Keir Starmer's future as the leader of Labour. And as you say, there have been private conversations about this. And for the people who've expressed discontent with the leadership, there are other people that say even entertaining the notion of some sort of leadership challenge would be just so politically damaging in and of itself. And we saw what happened when Andy Burnham sort of flirted with the notion so publicly. And there was actually quite a big backlash to that from other people saying, pipe down Andy Burnham, but this is not what the party needs right now. But you cannot get away from the fact that on the horizon looming is that really critical set of elections in May. So the Senedd elections, Holyrood elections and local elections in England. And if those results match where the polls are right now, there will be a conversation about what happens to the Labour Party and where it goes. It's worth remembering, though, that actually it's quite difficult in Labour Party mechanics to challenge the leadership. You know, so the question might ultimately become, if this becomes a conversation that Christina McAnay's kind of at least alive to and publicly has sort of indulged in this morning, if that does become a broader conversation within Labour after those elections, I think it might come to this point where does Keir Starmer, with his kind of public service head on and something that he says he believes so much in, does there come a point where he looks at the results for Labour? If they're bad, and who knows, we don't know what the main results are going to be at all. If they're bad, does he then start to look at himself and his leadership as much as everybody else might end up questioning it? Don't know. But like I say, there are also plenty that say stop talking about this stuff because in and of itself it's damaging to the party.
Well, that's right. And conventionally, you know, the public doesn't like divided political parties. They look like they're talking amongst themselves and scrapping in a sack instead of cracking on sorting out the problems that are important to the public. But political parties also can't ignore it if lots of them think that their leader isn't doing a very good job. Because if they think their leader isn't going to win them elections, then they're not going to stay in power. So there is that kind of creeping sense in some Labour circles that, like it or not, even if it would be messy, even if it would be awful, that the option of exploring, at the very least, changing the leadership might be something that they have to do. But, you know, we spoke about this a couple of weeks ago on one of the weekend pods with Paddy, and I wrote a piece about it in the run-up to the Labour conference. And talking to lots of different sources, it strikes me that there's two tests. One, does a political party have a majority of people agreeing that the current project is beyond repair? So if the answer to that is yes, then you get to the second question is, are you sure you have an alternative that is going to be more appealing to the public? And I don't think Labour has reached the conclusion yet where the answer to question one is, yes, we all agree. That might feel different the day after the May elections. But then the answer to question two is very, very problematic. There is not an obvious, more successful Labour candidate waiting in the wings. Andy Burnham, some people would say he kind of embarrassed himself at conference. He's not even an MP. Angela Rayner had to leave government after she messed up. Could she come back as leader? Don't know. Most people would tell you that Ed Miliband still really quite fancies the idea of that. I'm sure he'd deny it. But would he have the broad appeal to the public? And he lost an election before. So, dunno. Rachel Reeves doesn't have the political credibility that she did this time last year after all the things that have gone wrong for her. And once you start going down the list, it may be that there's lots of people in the Labour Party who sort of talk themselves out of it. But anyway, we're well into the realms of speculation and we're allowed to do that about politics. We started off saying we mustn't speculate about serious crimes. Absolutely true. But speculating about politics based on years of experience reporting, that's just fine.
Of course, it's all part of the job. And it's also just worth noting briefly that Christina McAnay did say that she thought Keir Starmer could pull it back.
She did.
And then shifted focused onto policy. And actually with that budget on the horizon, I think that's where a lot of the focus is going to be. The policy choices in the next few weeks and months, particularly around the budget, are going to be absolutely critical for Keir Starmer's Labour government to see whether or not that is meeting the concerns that definitely exist within the party about the direction that they are taking. So I think there's still, for all, as much as we love this speculation, and quite right that half of politics is speculation and how people respond to it. But, you know, I think in the short term, for sure, the real focus is going to be on the policy, not the personnel, and whether or not the Labour government goes in the direction that so many of its members want it to.
So newscasters stand by for weeks of headlines about make or break budgets, high noon, cabinet bust-ups over who's going to write big cheques. Stand by for more headlines about the country's debt and the deficit and whether Rachel Reeves really knows what she's doing. That's all to come on Newscast in the next few weeks. I think for this Sunday's episode, we're probably just about at an end. There will be, right across the BBC, more information, more news about that dreadful attack on the Doncaster to King's Cross train last night. So you can follow our colleagues who'll be working their socks off on that story. But Alex, I think we've reached an end. It's been lovely having you with me on this 2 days of our lovely duet. I've enjoyed our conversations very much. I hope people listening have too.
Me too. It's been an absolute pleasure, Laura. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And newscasters, thanks for listening. Remember, you can get in touch with us. Let us know what's on your mind. But we will say goodbye for now. And Adam will be here tomorrow.